morning and good evening and good afternoon, depends where you are. Welcome to our special dialogue program as part of the 7th China Global Think Tank Innovation Forum. My name is Henry Wang Huiyao, founder and president of Center for China and Globalization, which is the host of this forum. Actually, we started about 7 years ago with the University of Pennsylvania several think tank program. And so it's been 7th year we're running this conference, actually. So last year, I remember we had a dialogue with the president of CSI's John Hammer, and also for the past year, we have a dialogue with Larry Summers, with Pascal Lamy, with also Fred Burston, and many others. Of course, actually today, we just released a book. It's called Understanding Globalization, Global Gaps and Power Shift in the 21st Century, which is a CCG Global Dialogues. We have already collected 10 dialogues, including the Joseph Naila, Graham Allison, and many more. We hope that our new dialogue with Dr. Haass will be, again, also made into our collections. So we are very excited, actually, very thrilled to talk to a very senior diplomat, the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, and author The World, a brief introduction. So Dr. Richard Haass. Dr. Richard Haass is a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on American foreign policy, and a proven leader and manager of also in foreign policy circles. He is actually in his 20th years as a president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And we know that the Council on Foreign Relations was founded in 1921 as one of the first American think tanks. So Dr. Haass has extensive additional government experience. He was a special assistant to President George H.W. Bush and a senior director for Near East and South Asian affairs on the staff of National Security Council. Of course, previously he served in the diplomat of Department of State and also Defense, and was a legislative aide in the U.S. Senator. I think also Dr. Haass is a great think tank. He was actually a director of policy planning for the Department of State, where he directed the policy planning staff and was a principal advisor to the Secretary of State, Colin Powell. He also served as U.S. coordinator for policy towards the future of Afghanistan and U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. So Dr. Haass actually is also a prolific author or editor of 14 books on American and foreign policy, and also 1 book on management. I'm also very glad to hear that his next book, The Bill of Obligation, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, will be published by Pilgrim Press in January next year. So it's really a great honor to welcome Dr. Haass to our distinguished speakers dialogue. And also I had a privilege actually visiting your council quite a few times, and spoke there in 2017, and also met your colleagues of former colleague Elizabeth Economy, and now Ian Johnston, and Huang Yanzhong, and many others. We actually had a joint event in China in the past. So we also met your editor of the Foreign Affairs, Daniel Kurt Feldman, actually, when I was there in July. So such a great think tank and influential, policy magazine that you have running for so many years. So I would like to really thank you very much for joining us. Now, I would like to start first with some question on the think tanks. I mean, I know you wrote a piece about think tank 20 years ago when you were at policy planning department. But we know that think tanks these days is really making a lot of headlines, and of course making a lot of policy recommendations. But running a big think tank, Council of Foreign Relations, is such a great opportunity for 20 years. So very impressive. And you mentioned that you now have 120 some interns paid, and you have actually made council members 5,000 much younger and also diversified. A lot of women participation, minority participation. So in terms of running a think tank, what can you offer for our think tank summit? You know, we are having actually a think tank where over a few dozen think tank will join us also during this forum. So maybe I can start with you on this think tank management and think tank issue. That how did you manage your think tank for the past 20 years? What's your success factors for running a think tank?
First of all, thank you for having me, Dr. Wang. It's good to be with you again, if virtually. Look forward to, again, the day when it will be easy to do these things in person. I do think such exchanges are important, whether between governments or think tanks. Happy to talk about think tanks for a minute, because I've been here for 20 years at the Council on Foreign Relations, but I also spent years at the Brookings Institution, at the Institute for Strategic Studies in London, at the Carnegie Endowment. So I've spent probably, I don't know, 25 or 30 years in think tanks throughout my career. I believe the think tanks occupy an important place in the national conversation. On one hand, you have universities. Universities often deal with more theoretical concerns. They're very concerned about methodology, often quantitative analysis. They tend to be more removed from matters of policy. And then on the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, you have people, say, in government or business. And to be honest, they are busy. I've worked for 4 presidents at the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House. Now, when you're in government, you have all these things coming across your desk, and it's your challenge to keep up. I think it was Henry Kissinger who said that when you go into government, you no longer have the time to generate to intellectual capital. What you do is you tend to spend it down. You tend to use it because you're so busy meeting the challenges that come into your inbox. What I believe is valuable then about think tanks is they occupy the space in between the academia and, say, government. And think tanks have the time to do serious analysis, but they also have the responsibility and the obligation to produce what we call policy relevant analysis. It's got to be, think tanks have to produce work that explains what is going on or might be going on, about its significance, and also, where possible, think tanks have an obligation to provide policy recommendations. And that could be of use either for citizens or governments. And I think that's what makes them important, what makes them unique. Yeah. In the United States, what makes a think tank unique, again, is you're producing intellectual work. Again, that's policy relevant. We're also a place where you can train people. There's probably more than a dozen people in the current Biden administration who worked at the Council on Foreign Relations. You mentioned our intern program. Over the course of the next decade, we will train more than 1,000 interns, hundreds of young research assistants and associates, hundreds of fellows. So think tanks are in the business of producing ideas, but also of producing or developing people who can then assume more responsible positions in either government or business, journalism, or in the foreign policy conversation. We're lucky here at the Council on Foreign Relations. We have fellows producing books and articles. You mentioned Foreign Affairs Magazine. It's the leading magazine or journal in the world. We do it with meetings. We've also gone into the business of education. What we are trying to do is provide educational materials for young people in high schools as well as colleges and universities in order to teach them about the world, why it matters, how it operates, and so forth. So I believe that think tanks have enormous opportunities, but also significant responsibilities.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Haass. Yeah, I was actually I was reading your paper about 20 years ago, a think tank and U.S. foreign policy, a policymaker's perspective, which actually you mentioned the 5 benefits of a think tank. Ideal factory, and number 1, number 2, provide talent, and number 3, convenient professionals, and number 4, engage public, and then number 5, bridge differences. So with your extensive experience running, one of the oldest and most prestigious American think tanks, and serving as a director also on the other side of the government, the policy planning, the State Department. So what do you think? I mean, these days, bridging the difference, I think probably think tank probably needs to do more. What do you think about how we can make think tank to bridge more differences?
Well, think tanks can bridge differences in several ways. One is through what it is they write, that people who work, say, here at the Council on Foreign Relations can put forward ideas or recommendations. They can do it in articles, say in Foreign Affairs. They can do it in books. They can also do it in conversations like this. One thing we started years ago, probably about 10 years ago, I started here at the Council on Foreign Relations, is something we call the Council of Councils. And what we've done is we bring together maybe the representatives of maybe 24 think tanks around the world, where we discuss issues of global governance, how the world is tackling, or maybe should tackle, various global challenges. Think tanks can participate in track 2 or track 1.5 dialogues. Think tanks can have meetings like this one. So again, by the person-to-person side, as well as the intellectual side, I believe that think tanks have an important role to play. Again, I've been in government, and I know, when you're in government, you're busy. You're also under certain constraints when you're in government, because you have to represent official policy. And when you're working in a think tank, you have more space. You have a little bit more room to offer up suggestions. And when you say things, it doesn't have the weight of official policy. So I appreciate the difference from when I used to be in the government and I would be speaking for the government. And now I'm here and I no longer speak for the government, and it gives me a certain degree of freedom. Now, what I say may have less weight. I understand that, because I no longer represent the government. On the other hand, it has the weight of the content. Whatever, if there are good ideas, they're good ideas. And again, when you speak from a think tank, you have freedom. And what therefore can be useful is these kinds of dialogues can be a place where ideas can be introduced. And then if they are good ideas, then they can be brought into official channels. And I think that is one of the ways that think tanks, as you say, can bridge differences. And it can expose people in government to new ideas. And these people can then act on those ideas. So there's all sorts of ways in which outsiders can influence what insiders do.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Actually, I think you're right. I mean, I spent some time in the booking as well as a visiting fellow, but over a decade ago. But I think, the rise of American think tanks in the last century. I mean, you have a think tank over 100-some years, and where I think think tank in China, it's more actually developed in the recent, number of years, particularly in the last 10 years. According to the University of Pennsylvania, there's about over 2,000 think tanks in the United States, but there's about over 1,000 think tanks in China. So I think, probably we'll see more think tank exchanges and dialogues, and of course, your experience is very valuable, and I'm sure that the ideas and also the experience, success track record would actually stimulate a lot of our colleagues and peers here in China. I'm sure the think tank forum audience will be very much interesting to hear your views. Now let's get to more substantial dialogues now, and you wrote quite a few op-ed recently. You published one in the Foreign Affairs, and also Project Syndicate just a few days ago. We see the sharp decline in the world order, and then the causes and the consequences, and also how about the waning domestic support for the world order, and actually the book you're putting the bill of obligations, so we see the issue, we see the Ukraine, the Russian-Ukraine war, and then of course this is 2022 would be really remembered for this really unexpected big surprise, and of course also we have many other challenges, and is happening all at the same time. So a pandemic, I mean, we finally come to see some probably turning around, but again, I'd really like to know your book. You're going to publish that in January, but can you maybe discuss a bit about what's your thought, and how do you think about this new book you're having coming up? So maybe have a first a glimpse of that for our Chinese and also other international audience here hearing this dialogue.
Happy to. Any author is always happy to discuss his new book. This is a book, though, that's very different for me. I've written many books, and almost all of them are about either international relations or foreign policy, particularly American foreign policy. This is a book that's really about American democracy. This is a book that's aimed largely at Americans, and it introduces the idea that democracy, if it is to succeed, needs to rest on a foundation not just of rights, but also of obligations. And by obligations, I mean that citizens of a country, citizens of a society, have responsibilities to one another as well as to their country. And obligations are, what I define them, are things that citizens should do. And I distinguish between that and things they have to do. Things you have to do are a matter of law. And if you don't do them, you will face penalties. Obligations are something different. They are things, again, their behaviors, their attitudes that citizens, I believe, should do, and how they act to one another, in how they act towards their country. But they're not. It's not a matter of law, but it's because it's I believe desirable or good. And what I worry about my own country is I believe that we've become so focused on our rights that we've lost sight of our obligations. So this is, I want to start a conversation in my country about how do we rethink American democracy. We're nearly 2.5 centuries old. Our country began 2.5 centuries ago. Our Constitution is about 240 years old, and we've only had 27 amendments. But when we began, people forget this. When the United States began 250 years ago or so, we were a country of 3 million people. Today, we're a country of 330 million people. And we've changed in fundamental ways. Technology has changed and so forth. So my argument is simply that if American democracy is to not just survive, but to succeed, if it is to deliver for its citizens, that it needs to evolve, and our attitudes in this country, our behaviors need to evolve. It's about 2 years since we had a terrible day here on January 6th, 2 years ago, where we had politically inspired violence. And what I'm hoping is that we learn from that and we introduce different behaviors, different attitudes that will make sure such things never happen again. And I would say this is a domestic conversation, but it has real foreign policy consequences. The ability of the United States to act effectively in the world depends in part on there being social stability here at home. There has to be consensus to a degree here at home about our role in the world. So I think this conversation about American democracy, on one hand, is an internal conversation. On the other hand, it's a conversation that has tremendous consequences for the other 8 billion, nearly 8 billion people in the world, because what happens in the United States obviously has implications for the rest of the world. So this is a very different book for me. It's a very different focus. Normally I write about things like world order and US-China relations, or the use of force, or negotiations, or global arrangements. That's the kinds of things people like me normally think about and write about. But what led to this book is, I'm always asked when I speak publicly, people say, what keeps you up at night? What worries you? And they would say, is it US-China relations? Or is it Russia? Is it North Korea? Is it Iran? Is it climate change? Is it COVID? And I say, look, all of those things worry me. Those are all big challenges. But I believe the biggest challenge facing my country, and probably facing other countries, are domestic right now. And the same might be true of China, that the biggest challenges facing China may be more national or domestic than they are international. If countries are strong at home, it gives them the potential to act effectively in the world. And if they're divided at home, if they're weak at home, then they cannot act effectively in the world. And I won't speak for China, but I'll speak for the United States. I think that's true. So I believe we don't think of this as a national security challenge in my country, but I believe it is actually a national security challenge for the United States to make sure that its democracy is robust and it's conducted with certain constraints and certain rules, so that we are able to bridge. You mentioned the word bridge, our differences between the United States and China, but we also need a mechanism for peacefully bridging our differences here at home. And that's what I'm writing about.
Great. Thank you, Richard. I think this is really fascinating. I mean, from what I can hear, this is really a self-reflection. I mean, for a country like the US, actually, a very prestigious think tank leader like you to really think about self-reflection. That's probably, a bit paradigm shift, because I think that's true. As we all know, foreign policies start at the home. There is always you have a lot of things to think about yourself rather than really looking outward. I think China, you mentioned briefly China. I think China probably experienced some of that. We see the just concluded the 20th Party Congress really talk about common prosperity. They have lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Now, what about 300 million migrant workers? They have created a 400 million middle class, but what about 1 billion still not making it? So if every country really starting to look at its own problem and starting to really concentrate on solving that rather than looking outward for answers, probably we will have a better understanding. Because you mentioned about January 6th, storm of the Capitol. That's something U.S. is facing. Bravely now to that issue. But of course, I think China now is also facing this COVID, challenging and swiftly making changes. So every government has to, every society has to really look at its own issue. But I have a question. I mean, it looks like now. I mean, of course, 30 years after the Cold War, we probably want to see the world is in more multi-shape and forms. And I mean, last year we had this President Biden summit on democracy versus autocracy. It really, really a binary view. So because China has a different style of democracy, they have a consolidated democracy, they have have a whole process of democracies and meritocracy. All the officials has to be voted by examination papers in order to get promoted. So what do you think about this binary lens look at the world? And can we, just look at more at the domestic issue by ourselves rather than really looking at other countries? For example, also China wants to avoid this widening of haves and have-nots, and where I think some countries maybe that is also still a challenge. So what do you think about those issues? I think you're right. If we look at the domestic more, we may have a probably better understanding of compare apple to apples and how we can compare notes and find our own problems rather than blame the others.
Well,